Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Victober. It is at last October. We are now in Victober territory. This is an old and wonderful BookTube event celebrating the Victorian era of literature, which was an amazing outpouring of all kinds of great literature. We tend to think of it reflexively in terms of its marquee items: Trollope, Thackeray, George Eliot, Charles Dickens. But it was an outpouring of great writing in all kinds of areas. And today I want to concentrate on an outpouring of writing in my own area, my own chosen little patch of literature, and that is critical responses to literature, book reviewing, book essays, that sort of thing. Our figure is George Saintsbury, who was a poobah in that area. He was immediately recognized from his teen years on as being a keen and very insightful critic. He had, as most Victorians did, a gorgeous literary style that manages to combine almost ornate eloquence with straightforwardness. It's almost impossible to do that. And the Victorians, almost all of them do it. Hell, grocery clerks could do it. If you were just writing out a food order, they could do it. Seemed to be something in the air. Saintsbury's talents were recognized early on, and he lived that way. He lived basically by his pen. He had a couple of other occupations, but he produced literature. He wrote literary responses, essays, and things like that his whole life. He was also a great editor. He did, for instance, if you want to get too much in the weeds, he did an editorial update, a new sheen of annotations and facelifts, editorial facelifts, on the huge collected works of John Dryden that had been done by Sir Walter Scott. That Walter Scott's edition of Dryden is a monument of editorial excellence on its own, and Saintsbury actually improved it. But he did a lot of other things too, and one of his favorite things to do in his life was overviews of bodies of literature. He did a couple of great books, really introducing the general English reading public to what was going on to the major works in French literature. He did a lot of that. But he also wrote the book that I wanted to concentrate on today, which is the English novel, where he looks at the English novel from medieval times to just before the doorstep of his own time. And it's wonderful to have a guide like this along for such a book. These books like this that are surveys of English literature, can be deadly, absolutely deadly. I could point out a couple, for instance, Ford Madox Ford. Try getting your way through his equivalent to this book. This, you won't be able to put it down. Saintsbury is so good, even when you don't agree with him. And of course, this isn't an encyclopedia, right? This book is not an encyclopedia. So it's, in other words, full of opinions. It's full of pronouncements. So you're not going to agree with everything that he says here. But you're going to love reading it. The chapters, have I got a chapter heading here? Let me get the chapters here for you so you know what you get here. Okay, chapter 1 is Foundation in Romance. Chapter 2 goes from Lily to Swift. Then the four wheels of the novel, minor and later 18th century novelists. Then chapter 5, which I want to talk about today, Scott and Miss Austen. That's Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen. Then The Succession, all the way to Thackeray. Then the mid-Victorian novel, and finally Fiction of Yesterday, which you have to use a sliding scale for it, because Saintsbury was born in the full noon, the first noon of the Victorian era. He was born in 1845. So he spent the first 60 years of his life with Victoria on the throne, in the full light of the Victorian era. So he's definitely a creature of the Victorian era. He went on to live through the Edwardian era at least, but I think he also lived through World War I. And just kept writing the whole time. And his observations in this book are amazingly good. Now, one of the little fringe benefits of me calling all of these Victorians to your attention in the course of Victober, I had a Steve stream last night or the night before, in which I brought up the subject of doing many Victober videos, and I brought up the subject, the caution, the worry that maybe the other co-hosts, maybe the co-hosts of Victober wouldn't like that, but ultimately I decided, BookTube is what you make it. You can't be making your own videos for other people. So I might do a lot of videos on somewhat minor, maybe forgotten Victorian figures. And the great thing about them, about people like George Saintsbury, is that a lot of their works will be on Project Gutenberg. Probably not all of them, but a lot of them. Which, again, for those of you who are new to BookTube, Project Gutenberg is an online site with very well curated, there are no mistakes, well curated editions of books that are in the common domain, so that if you e-read, if you have a Kindle or an iPad or whatever, there are tens of thousands of books on Project Gutenberg that you can get for free. I'm not going to say all, but a lot of Saintsbury will be there. For instance, I doubt very much that Project Gutenberg has his edition of Scott's Dryden. I don't know how hard that would be to come by, but I also don't know how many people would want to come by it. But Saintsbury's the English novel or other essays that he's done, they'll all be on there. All of his popular stuff that he did in popular editions for the general reading public will be on there, and they're wonderful. I want to give you a couple of examples from Scott and Austen and see what you think of it. See whether or not you agree with him. Like, for instance, when he talks about what Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen did to the English novel, his pronouncement, which is kind of amazing considering what an expert he was on the 18th century, his pronouncement on the subject it brings you up short. Brings me up short every time I read it. He writes, interesting as each of these two great novelists is individually, the interest of the pair, from our present historical point of view, is almost greater, and the way in which they complete each other is hardly short of uncanny. Before their time, despite the great examples of prose fiction produced by Bunyan, Defoe, Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne, and the remarkable determination towards the life of the ordinary society given or instanced by Miss Burney, despite the immense novel production of the last half of the 18th century and the first decade of the 19th, it is hardly too much to say that the novel, as such, had not found its proper way or ways at all before these two. What do you think of that? Do you agree with that? I kind of agree with it myself. I kind of think that I like that. He goes on in the course of just this one chapter to talk about Jane Austen. I think it's pretty clear that he liked Jane Austen more than he did Sir Walter Scott, even though Walter Scott is much more his line of country. He was a devoted Janeite, to put it mildly. He was a devoted Janeite. And he writes at one point about Jane Austen's initial appearance in publication. He writes, it is doubtful whether if Northanger Abbey had actually appeared in 1796 it would have been appreciated. Miss Austen, like other writers of genius, had, not exactly as the common but incorrect phrase goes, to create the taste for her own work, but to arouse the long dormant appetite which she was born to satisfy. So here he's riffing just a bit on the common sentiment, which he, here and in a couple of other places, especially a couple of his lectures, seems to take issue with, although I can attest it is absolutely true. And I don't think that he actually did take issue with it. The truism that he's taking a little bit of a whack at here is the idea that is often said to writers that writers have to create the taste for their own books. If they've got originality, if they've got the fire of genius in them, it's by necessity going to be something new to the reading public. So they need to create that. They need to create an appetite for it. They need to create their own audience. That was said in Jane Austen's day. It was said in Saintsbury's day. It is said today, and I believe it is completely true. You write something, and the reading audience doesn't know that it wanted it. You have to create your audience. He's adding a typically subtle variation of his own to that. He's saying not that you have to create the taste for your own work, but that the taste for your own work is there already. It's dormant, and you are born to arouse it. I think it's a distinction without a difference, but it's really, really well done. And the rest of this is too. The English novel is free on Project Gutenberg, and to celebrate Victober, I mean, certainly I'm not one to downplay the great Titanic works that are always mentioned every Victober. And certainly, if you have not read some Anthony Trollope or even some Charles Dickens, you really should. You definitely shouldn't let another year go by before you read an Elizabeth Gaskell. But some of these lesser-known authors who are now completely gone, no one is ever going to make selected or greatest hits of Saintsbury. No one's going to do that. They're completely gone. I thought maybe for Victober I might mention a few of these people that are completely gone. I may even venture across the pond and deal with some Victorian era American writers as well. But anyway, that's your Victober, your little Victober bit for today is George Saintsbury. Try and make his, if you like reading about literature in addition to reading literature, you might try making his acquaintance. I think you might like the voice that you find on the page. So that's Victober for today. I will wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, Victober.